More on Senator Sanders' surge in the polls and the Democrats' campaign strategy. We want to bring in our guest, Kevin Madden. He served as a senior strategist and spokesman for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. Also, Donald Schneider is here, economist at the policy research team at Cornerstone Macro. Prior to Cornerstone, Don served as chief economist on the House Ways and Means Committee. You're here at the desk, so I'll start with you. You look at the surge with Sanders. There's a surge in terms of the voting, or rather in terms of the polls. Not, though, in terms of, if you look at some of the predicted polls and some of the other things, in terms of how people are making bets.
I think he's actually in the lead in the betting markets right now.
But it has not. But you've seen other people surge. You've seen Bloomberg, for example, surge in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And, everyone has had their chance at the top of the betting markets. Right. But I think, right now, Sanders is in a really good position to win in Iowa.
And does that then carry over elsewhere, or do you think that's very state-specific?
I think it does carry over. Not only does Iowa give you a lot of legitimacy, a lot of momentum going forward, I think he's already in the lead in New Hampshire. So I think that could kind of push into Biden's firewall in South Carolina. He may not win there, but he may do better than expected.
Right. Kevin, I'm curious. We've been having a conversation all morning about Michael Bloomberg, who came out with his new wealth tax. I don't know if we're calling it a wealth tax. We're calling it a new tax on wealth over the weekend. I think to get a little bit closer, frankly, to where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren may very well be. The question is, does that move the needle? And to the extent that Bernie Sanders does well right now, does that push Bloomberg out of the game completely later? Because that was always one of the big issues.
Yeah, Bloomberg's been pulled into what a lot of folks, even some of the more moderate names inside this field have done, which is trying to micro-target their way to up the polls by appealing to a lot of these most base activist Democrats, liberals, on things like economic policy, environmental policy, and social policy. But I think, it's very hard to kickstart a presidential campaign. But Bloomberg's play, which has always been sort of trying to get an inside straight on the river card, has been to have Bernie Sanders get a couple of wins in these early states, and then essentially have a establishment freakout so that there's a consolidation behind Bloomberg, whereas he and Bernie Sanders are the only ones standing after Bernie Sanders has a couple of wins in these early primary states.
Okay, Kevin, this is a full rope-a-dope plan you have going.
Well, it's not my plan. That's Bloomberg. That's Bloomberg's plan.
You see Rahm Emanuel's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, where the establishment is freaking out.
But Kevin, you think it's a true rope-a-dope. You think that Bloomberg really wants Bernie Sanders to win tomorrow?
Well, I think he's banking on the idea that Bernie Sanders gets a couple of these wins, and then there's only a few candidates left standing, and they're the ones who have the money. Bernie Sanders will always have the money. That's one of his biggest powers inside this field, which is that by farming all these grassroots donations, he's consistently led the way quarter after quarter in fundraising. So if it's Bernie Sanders, Mike Bloomberg, and maybe Tom Steyer, who still has his money in the game, that really represents the best chance for Bloomberg to sort of help consolidate the field inside the Democratic establishment.
I do, yeah.
You think that's the whole plan?
Yeah, because I think, if with Bloomberg being allowed into the debates, and then you're seeing, I think if he does, it's going to come at the expense of Biden, and then you're really looking at someone not only.
Don't forget Rahm Emanuel's op-ed, but also you had John Kerry, our colleagues at NBC News, reporting that John Kerry was doing conversations with his potential donors out in the Des Moines hotel about what it would take for him to get in. So there's clearly some worry about the surge and the trend line that Bernie Sanders has right now inside the Democratic primary.
And Kerry went on the record very deliberately and said, I am not running. Right. But when you see the whole conversation that the NBC News producer overheard, clearly there was a conversation about whether or not he might get in.
Definitely indicative of a worry.
Look, these caucuses are different, right? Because the first go-round, you vote for whoever you want. But then, if your candidate doesn't get 15%, you have to vote for someone else. What's likely to happen in that scenario? Is it going to be Bernie Sanders gets all of Elizabeth Warren's? Or are they both going to still get 15%, and that will divide that population to some point? I mean, this is going to be interesting, because if you're forced to actually go ahead and change your vote to somebody who has at least 15%, that gets rid of a lot of the noise that's out there when you have 11 candidates running.
Right. I think, Klobuchar, she's, right now at the lowest, and I think all of her votes should probably go mostly to Biden, but then I think that favors him. At the same time, I think Warren will probably make that threshold. But I think it's going to be split between Biden and Sanders, and it's really unclear.
Can I just ask you sort of what I call the rational actor question? One of the things that you keep hearing on this show and elsewhere is that ultimately the party, the voter, will be a rational actor, meaning they will only be trying to elect through the primary system somebody they think that can beat President Trump. So the question is, and to the extent that virtually all the polls show that Bernie Sanders can't beat Trump, what is going on here?
I think, there's one difference in terms of what you look for in a nomination process, and that's ideological purity, someone who's very satisfying and kind of speaks to, the most effective,
So the rational actor idea may not be so rational.
I think Bernie Sanders' electability is being relitigated now. I think, throughout this entire process, you've had everyone else who's come in first in the betting markets tank and fall off because it looked like they couldn't beat Trump. Bernie's never really had that test this time around, and he's now getting a second look at the best possible time. And I think they think he can win.